Cham, and I am tasked to discuss on diseases of your large bowel. We'll start on colonic polyps and colorectal cancer. These three famous personalities died from one common illness, and that is colorectal cancer or colon cancer. Colorectal cancer appears to be second only to lung cancer as the cause of death in the USA. The incidence of which has decreased significantly during the past 25 years due to enhanced screening practices. Most colorectal cancers arise from your adenomatous polyps. Polyps are grossly visible protrusion from the mucosal surface of your colon. There are three types: the hamartomatous, an example of which is your juvenile polyp, hyperplastic polyp, and adenomatous polyp, all of which are benign protrusion from your mucosal surface. Among these three, adenomatous polyp is said to be premalignant, and minority of which becomes cancer in the future. They said that 30% of middle-aged people can have adenomatous polyp, while 50% of the elderly may develop adenomatous polyp, and only less than 1% of this adenomatous polyp can become malignant. Polyps are said to be asymptomatic. Now, the The development of polyp to cancer is a multi-step procedure. So these are the steps that lead into the development of malignancy. There is a point mutations in the KRAS photo-oncogene. There is hypomethylation of your DNA, which leads to gene activation. There is loss of DNA or allelic loss at the site of a tumor suppressor gene, and allelic loss at the chromosome 17p. This is associated with mutations in the p53 tumor suppressor gene. So simply, this means that altered proliferative pattern of the colonic mucosa, the mutational activation of an oncogene, and coupled with the loss of genes that normally suppress your tumorogenesis. What is the probability of an adenomatous polyp becoming cancer? Depends on the gross appearance of your lesion, the histologic features, and the size. So this is an example of your polyps. The first column or the first picture is said to be a sessile polyp. The middle picture is the colonic carcinoma, and the last picture is an ulcerative tumor or ulcerative cancer of your colon. Now, adenomatous polyps may be pedunculated, like the upper picture, or a sessile or flat base, which is the lower picture. Most of the cancer frequently arise from your sessile polyps or the flat base polyps. Histologically, adenomatous polyp may be tubular, villus, or example of the villus are papillary or tubulovillus. Among the three types of adenomatous polyp, the villus adenoma is the most of which are sessile, may become malignant more than 3 times as often as your tubular adenomas, which is the most benign. The polyp size in relation to invasive cancer is, if your polyp is less than 1.5 centimeter, there is less than 2% of the polyp to become malignant in the future. An intermediate polyp size, which is said to be 1.5 to 2.5 centimeters, has 2 to 10% chance of becoming cancer in the future, while substantial 10% in the lesions of more than 2.5 centimeters in size becomes malignant in the future. So this is the sequence, as we said a while ago, that from adenoma to carcinoma sequence, so from normal epithelium, this epithelium becomes dysplastic and becomes adenoma, and later on become carcinoma, and eventually metastasize to other organs. Okay, so adenomatous polyps are thought to require more than 5 years of growth before becoming clinically significant. So this is an example of an ulcerated colon adenocarcinoma, causes the narrowing of the colonic lumen. So this may cause large bowel obstruction eventually if the lesion becomes significantly big, like in this picture. What are the risk factors for colorectal cancer? First is your diet. We know that fat-rich diet or animal fat-rich diet is a risk factor for the development of colorectal cancer. Hereditary syndromes, which are the autosomal dominant inheritance, such as your polyposis coli and non-polyposis syndrome or the Lynch syndrome, your IBDs, your Streptococcus bovis bacteremia, and tobacco usage of more than 35 years are the risk factors in the development of the colorectal cancer. Diet which is rich in meat protein and dietary fat and oil, as well as elevation of your serum cholesterol are risk factors in the development of cancer. So what is the hypothesis for this? An ingestion of your animal fats found in red meats and processed meats, such as your longanisa, your tocino, your tapa, leads to an increased proportion of anaerobes in the gut microflora. This results in the conversion of your normal bile acids into carcinogens. So that's the hypothesis in the development of cancer among diet rich in fats. So the risk factors for colorectal cancer, if you are more than 50 years old, 50 years old and above is a risk factor for the development of colorectal cancer, because majority of patients in the elderly age group, such as 50 years old and above, are prone to develop already polyps. This is the reason why colonoscopy as a screening procedure for polyps is being encouraged among 50 years old and above. If there's a family history of colorectal cancer, so what is this family history? If you have a first-degree relative with colorectal cancer history at 60 years old and below, or if you have 2 or more first and second-degree relatives diagnosed with colorectal cancer at any age for that matter. If you have a personal history of adenomatous polyps or serrated adenomas or colorectal cancer, patients with history of hereditary colorectal syndromes, and patients with inflammatory bowel disease. Social and lifestyle habits can also be a risk factor in the development of your colorectal cancer, such as smoking, excessive alcohol intake, and physical inactivity. Your dietary habits is also a risk factor. So people who are obese, eating low fiber and high fat in consumption and low calcium. These are the people said to be at risk for the development of colorectal cancer. So what are the hereditary factors and syndrome? 25% of patients with colorectal cancer have a positive family history of colorectal cancer. Inherited large bowel cancers can be divided into 2 main groups: the polyposis syndromes, which is rare, and the non-polyposis syndrome. This non-polyposis coli, or the familial polyposis of the colon, is a rare condition which is characterized by the appearance of thousands of adenomatous polyps throughout the large bowel, such as in the picture. Those are thousands and thousands of polyps in your large bowel. So your familial adenomatous polyposis, your Gardner syndrome, and Turcot syndromes are the familial, the different types of polyposis that can lead to colorectal cancer. Hereditary non-polyposis colon cancer is also known as Lynch syndrome. This is again another autosomal dominant syndromes such as your colonic polyposis. This is the same. Both of them are autosomal dominant trait. The presence of three or more relatives with histologically documented colorectal cancer, and one of whom is a first degree relative of the two other, and one or more cases of colorectal cancer diagnosed before the age 50 in the family, or colorectal cancer involving at least two generations, are said to be hereditary non-polyposis colon cancer. So these are the syndromes under your hereditary um, hereditary non I'm sorry. So these are so these are the hereditary gastrointestinal polyposis syndrome. You have your familial adenomatous polyposis, your Gardner's syndrome, your Turcotte syndrome, your non-polyposis syndrome, which is your Lynch syndrome, your Pugh-Jegur syndrome, and your juvenile polyposis. Um, IBD, or your inflammatory bowel disease, is said to have um, a risk factor in the development of your colon cancer. And colon cancers increase in incidence in long-standing inflammatory bowel disease. Cancers develop more commonly in patients with ulcerative colitis. Other risk conditions are tobacco use and Streptococcus bovis bacteremia, the reason of which is still unknown. So what are the screening procedures that we use in the diagnosis of your colorectal cancer? We can use rigid proctosigmoidoscopy, your flexible or fiber optic sigmoidoscopy, which we are now using, but more often now, what we use really is colonoscopy. Digital rectal examination and fecal occult blood testing can also be a good screening procedure. The screening techniques for large bowel cancer in asymptomatic persons remain unsatisfactory, and compliance with any screening strategy within the general population is still poor. Okay, so if you have a family history of polyps or colorectal cancer, example, if you have a first degree relative with only small tubular adenomas, the average, same as the average risk, while the single first degree relative with colorectal cancer or advanced adenoma at the age of more than 60 or 60 and above, colonoscopy can be done as a screening procedure every 10 years starting at the age of 40. If you have a single first degree relative with colorectal cancer or advanced adenoma at the age of less than 60 years old, or two first degree relatives with colorectal cancer or advanced adenoma at any age, colonoscopy should be done every 5 years, beginning at age 40 or 10 years younger than the age of diagnosis of the youngest affected relative, whichever is earlier. So that means you have to get the index age of the patient. That means that the youngest member of the family who had a history of colorectal cancer or advanced adenomatous polyps, then that will be the basis. Minus 10 years their age should be the basis of the start of the screening procedure for colonoscopy. Okay. Patients with familial adenomatous polyposis, sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy should be done annually or yearly. This starts at the age of 10 to 12 years old. And you need to consider also genetic counseling and testing. For hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer, colonoscopy every 2 years, beginning at the age of 20 to 25 years old, or 10 years younger than the index age group, or until the patient reach 40 years old, then annual colonoscopy thereafter. Okay, so this is how you screen patients with family history of colonic polyp. What about if you have a personal history of polyps or colorectal cancer? If you have one or two small or less than 1 centimeter adenomas with low-grade dysplasia by histology, you may repeat your colonoscopy after 5 to 10 years. This is assuming that your complete polyp resection was done. Interval may vary based on prior history or family history. If you were able to remove 3 to 10 adenomas or any high-risk adenoma, you must repeat the colonoscopy in 3 years, in 3 years' time. So subsequent colonoscopy is based on the histologic findings or the colonoscopic findings. So if you still find adenomas, you will repeat again. If it is 1 or 2, then you have to repeat it after 5 years, assuming that you complete again polyp resection. If you found more than 10 adenomas in a patient with a patient with a personal history of colorectal cancer or personal history of having polyps, you repeat your colonoscopy in less than 3 years based on your critical judgment. Piecemeal removal of sessile polyp can be done, but examination in 2 to 6 months to verify complete removal should be done. Okay? So if you have small or less than 1 centimeter hyperplastic polyps of sigmoid and rectum, you may repeat your colonoscopy after 10 years. Those with hyperplastic polyposis syndrome merit more frequent follow-up, of course. Sessile serrated adenoma or polyp less than 10 millimeter without dysplasia, you repeat your colonoscopy in 5 years' time. While sessile serrated adenoma or adenomatous polyp of 10 or more 10 millimeters or with dysplasia or more than 2 serrated polyps, you have to repeat your colonoscopy in 3 years' time. Because serrated polyposis syndrome warrants or merits more frequent follow-up. Because these are the common polyps that leads into malignancy. I'm sorry, I got lost. I'm sorry. Okay. So if you have incompletely removed serrated polyp of 1 cm or more, examination should be done in 2 to 6 months to verify complete removal. Colon cancer should be evaluated around the time of resection, then repeat colonoscopy in 1 year. Subsequent colonoscopy in 3 years if 1 year examination after the surgery is normal. All right. For average risk patients, these are the asymptomatic people of 50 years old and above, or 45 years old and above for African Americans. So these are the recommendations. You do colonoscopy every 10 years. And this is preferred cancer prevention strategy. Your annual fecal occult blood testing or CT colonography every 5 years or flexible sigmoidoscopy every 5 years can be done, while your double contrast barium enema every 5 years and stool DNA test every 3 years can also be an option for an average risk patient. So that means that this patient is an average risk if he is already 50 years old and above, unless he is an African American. Patients with IBDs, okay? If the IBD is long-standing, what is the meaning of long-standing? Meaning that the IBD has been there for more than 8 years, okay? Ulcerative pancolitis or Crohn's colitis or left-sided ulcerative colitis of more than 15 years duration, colonoscopy with biopsies every 1 to 2 years should be considered, okay? So what are the clinical features? It varies with the anatomic location of the tumor. Your cecum and your ascending colon tumors may become quite large without resulting in any obstructive symptoms or any alteration in your bowel habits. Lesions commonly ulcerate, leading to chronic insidious blood loss. So your patient may present as body weakness and anemia. While your transverse and descending colon tumors, okay, so this means that this is already on the left side, tend to impede the passage of your stool, meaning this may result into obstruction. So patients may develop abdominal cramps, occasional symptoms of obstruction, and even perforation. Okay, your barium enema often reveal characteristic annular constricting lesion, which is the apple core or napkin ring appearance by barium enema. So this is the apple core appearance or uh, the apple core appearance of your barium enema. That is your colon. And that is the sigmoid part of the colon. So rectosigmoid tumors are associated with hematochezia, may be associated with tenesmus, and the small caliber of your stool or narrowing of the caliber of the stool. Anemia is an infrequent finding. So how to stage your colorectal cancer? You use CT scan of the whole abdomen with contrast. You may use endoscopic ultrasound, and of course, your chest x-ray may give you a clue that there is a metastasis to the lungs. So in the staging, this is the stages of your colorectal cancer. When you after the surgery, that is the time that you can stage your colorectal malignancy. So this is the stage 1, which means that you have T1 to 2, no nodes involved and no metastasis involved. So this means that the superficial lesions does not invade your regional lymph nodes and does not penetrate through the submucosa or the muscularis mucosa. Stage 2 disease or the T3 NOMO, it penetrates through your muscularis but does not spread again to your lymph nodes and no distant metastasis as well. Stage 3 is TXN1 meaning MO, meaning the disease has reached your original lymph node, and your stage 4, meaning that there is already a distant metastasis of the lungs and the liver. So this means whatever is the affection, whether this is a superficial lesion, whether this affects the muscularis or the submucosal region, it doesn't matter in stage 3 and 4. As long as there is an involvement of regional lymph node, it is already stage 3. While in stage 4, if it involves a metastatic spread or metastatic lesion from the distant organs such as your liver, lung, and bone, then that becomes stage 4, be it T1, T2, or T3. And what is the prognosis of colorectal cancer? The prognosis may be more precisely gauged by the number of your involved lymph nodes. So 1 to 3 lymph nodes versus more than 4 lymph nodes has a better prognosis than 4 and above lymph nodes. Other predictors of poor prognosis after surgical resection, if there is tumor penetration through the bowel wall into pericolic fat, if there is poorly differentiated malignancy by histology. So there is perforation or tumor adherence to adjacent organs. So you have already what we call tumor adhesions to other organs. And if there is venous invasion by the tumor, so that means that the tumor is already carried by your veins through other part of the bodies, to other organs of the body. So these are the predictors. We already mentioned this. And colon cancer may spread to regional lymph nodes or to the liver via portal venous circulation. Liver is the most frequent site of metastasis. Tumors in the rectum may metastasize directly to your lungs by passing through the liver. So as to the treatment, total resection of the colon, a colonic tumor, is the optimal treatment. Evaluation for metastatic disease, including a thorough physical examination, your chest x-ray, your liver function test, your CEA level performed prior to your surgery. So you have to get these laboratory examinations or blood chemistries prior to the surgery. So your radiation therapy to the pelvis for patients with rectal cancer is also being entertained because it reduces 20 to 25% of probability of regional recurrences. So that is for the rectal cancer. What about systemic therapy? So there are patients being given a combination of post-op radiation therapy with 5-FU and pre-op radiotherapy for patients with large unresectable rectal cancer, so that the purpose of which is to shrink a little bit the lesion and enough to permit subsequent surgical removal. So still, the optimum requirement is still surgery at the end. Radiation therapy is not effective in the primary treatment of colon cancer. So you must remember that. So these are the other modalities that we use. Okay. Those patients who develop hepatic metastasis, if it is small and solitary without clinical or radiographic evidence of additional tumor involvement, you may consider partial liver resection in those cases. But again, it is very difficult to convince, especially if your patient is an elderly patient, to undergo such. Okay, so let's go now to diverticular diseases and anorectal diseases. Diverticular diseases in the USA, 60% of the population is elderly, so more than 60 years old. 30% of which become symptomatic with recurrent symptoms. 4% of these elderly with diverticular problem may require hospitalization. But less than 1% of them will require surgery. Diverticular disease is said to be uncommon in younger age group, especially people less than 40 years old. This commonly affects the left side of your colon. So among Asians, they said that the most of the Asians will develop diverticulosis at the right side of the colon, while the Americans, North Americans, Europeans, Australians, the most commonly affected is your left side. The sigmoid colon is commonly seen among patients who are Americans or from the US. Males and females affections are just the same, but males tend to affect younger age group. So the mean age now is shifting to younger age group. So 40 years old to less than 60, there are many patients found to have diverticulosis as well. So there are two types of your diverticulum, the true and the false diverticulum. So you know that both are sac-like herniation of your entire bowel wall. So meaning to say those sac-like herniation are the weak bowel mucosa. So for false diverticulum, for true diverticulum, I should say, there is a sac-like herniation of the entire bowel wall. While false diverticulum, the protrusion of mucosa and the mucosa and submucosa only through the muscularis propria. most common type of diverticulum affects your colon. Okay? The diverticula occur at the point where the nutrient artery or vasa recti penetrates through muscularis propria, resulting in a break in the integrity of the colonic wall. So this leads to pockets or outpouching of your colonic wall. This anatomic restriction may be a result of relatively high pressure zone within the muscular sigmoid colon. Low fiber diet used to believe the sole culprit, but now pathogenesis becomes complex and more multifactorial. So one of the pathogenesis now is higher amplitude contractions. This can be combined with your constipated, high fat content stool within the sigmoid lumen in an area of weakness in the colonic wall. Other factors are gut microbiome dysbiosis. So the presentation is usually diverticular bleeding. Since diverticulosis is an asymptomatic problem, patients usually does not know whether they have diverticular problem or not unless they underwent a screening colonoscopy, for example. So diverticular bleeding or hemorrhage most commonly is the cause of hematochezia among patients who are more than 60 years old. 20% will have a GI bleeding. The risk increases among patients with hypertension, people with atherosclerosis, those who use aspirin and NSAIDs. The lifetime risk of bleeding is about 25%. Mostly of the diverticular bleeding are self-limited and stops with bowel rest, or when you put the patient to NPO, after a while, eventually the bleeding will stop spontaneously. So this is the example of the diverticulosis. As you see, there is a stigmata of the recent bleeding at 5 o'clock, diverticula. Okay, so you see a stigmata or the blood vessel there inside the outpouch or the herniated mucosa. So that is the cause of the diverticular bleeding. So what are the diagnostic examinations that can help you out in the diagnosis of your diverticular bleed? Will barium enema help? Barium enema may help in the diagnosis of diverticulosis, but not in bleeding. Colonoscopy can see the actual site of bleeding. So you can see the actual bleeding, or you may be able to appreciate the stigmata or the blood vessel. CT angiogram and RBC tagging is more diagnostic. Treatment of hemorrhage. So angiography, by angiography, the vessels are occluded with a coil embolization. So that's how they do it. While segmental resection of the colon among patients who bleed massively, becoming unstable and requiring more than 6 units of blood upon admission or upon the episode of bleeding, these are the strong candidates for surgical correction. Your vasopressin may also help, but they said that rebleeding may happen in 50% of patients once you stop giving your vasopressin. Endoscopic therapy, such as injection with diluted epinephrine with epinephrine of 1:10,000 dilution, or hemoclip, is very good therapeutically to control the bleeding. What about if this diverticulosis becomes infected? We call that acute diverticulitis. So meaning there is inflammation and infection of your diverticulum. For uncomplicated acute diverticulitis, your patient may develop fever, abdominal pain, constipation, obstipation, meaning to say patient cannot move, okay, and there is leukocytosis as well. For complicated acute diverticulitis, patients may have secondary complications such as your abscess formation, perforation. You may develop stricturing and fistula formation. For acute uncomplicated diverticulitis, it is also known as symptomatic uncomplicated diverticular disease. So these are the symptoms. Patients may develop fever, cannot eat, there is a left lower quadrant pain, and patient cannot move. So less than 25% of patients with peritonitis may lead to perforation. So for complicated diverticular disease, around 16% may develop abscess formation and perforation in 10%, stricturing in 5%, and only 2% may develop fistula. So perforated diverticular disease is staged using the Hinchey classification system. While in complicated diverticular disease with fistula formation, common locations include cutaneous, vaginal, or vesical fistula. So these are the common locations where you develop fistula among patients with diverticulosis or diverticulitis. So what are the diagnostic modalities that you use? The test and the best and the choice diagnostic exam is your CT scan. So what do you see by CT scan? You can appreciate the diverticulum. You see the thickened colonic wall. So meaning to say it becomes more than 4 millimeters. There is inflammation within the pericolic fat, and 20% of patients during CT scan, they may appreciate abscess formation. What about plain abdominal X-ray? Sometimes if you have giant diverticulum of the sigmoid, you may see air fluid level. Colonoscopy 6 weeks after your acute diverticulitis is warranted. Why? Because you cannot do colonoscopy during the episode of acute diverticulitis because you have a high index of perforation. High incidence of perforation may happen if you are suspecting acute diverticulitis. Just do CT scan, and colonoscopy can be done later on, perhaps 6 weeks after you have treated your diverticulitis. That's the time you do colonoscopy because you want to rule out malignancy. So what are the problems or other problems or differential diagnoses that you can entertain with diverticulitis? Well, IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, ovarian cyst, endometriosis, acute appendicitis, especially if your diverticular problem is on the right side, and PIDs. So how do you manage? By medical management, you give patients with a fiber-enriched diet. So that means that you have to increase the fiber to 30 grams per day because this will increase your colonic transit time so that patient will be able to defecate daily, because whenever you constipate and obstipate in an elderly bowel, so when you age, your bowels also age, okay? So your colon becomes more prone to weakness and herniation. Therefore, as you age, you must enjoy eating fiber-rich foods, which are the vegetables and the fruits, okay? So that you can increase your colonic transit time and be able to defecate, okay? So you need fiber-rich food. You should avoid smoking. And in diverticulitis, you may give your broad-spectrum antibiotics for 7 to 10 days, covering specifically your gram-negative bacteria. You must rest your bowel. So you place the patient on NPO while there is ongoing infection. You may put the patient on TPN first while treating the ongoing infection. Okay, you may give your mesalazine if you are thinking of IBDs. Rifaximin is a poorly absorbed broad-spectrum antibiotic if your patient is a candidate for oral medication already. And since part of the pathogenesis is your dysbiosis, gut dysbiosis, then probiotics may help. So surgical management is recommended among patients with low risk, but no improvement with medical management was seen, and complications of diverticular disease is already appreciated. So if your patients went into sepsis, then you have to control the massive infection in the blood or the septicemia. You have to eliminate the complications such as your obstruction and fistula formation. You have to remove the diseased colonic segments, and you have to restore intestinal continuity. Okay, so this is the Hinchey stage that we are talking about. Just read this on your book. So this is the management as we were talking about. Okay, so your Hinchey 1 and 2, your percutaneous drainage and resection 6 weeks later. So you have to drain first your abscess before you resect after 6 weeks. For abscesses more than 3 centimeters in size, you have to drain it also. For less than 3, this may resolve completely by giving your antibiotics alone. So what is the contraindication in draining your abscess? If you have no route, you have peritonitis, and you have pneumoperitoneum. So you have to do already explore lab and remove the diseased colon. Now, the Hartmann procedure, so this means that there is proximal anastomosis and proximal diversion of your colon. That is what we call Hinchey 3. But the recurrence of the problem happens in 10% of the patients. So after your diverticular disease, we go now to inflammatory bowel disease. So inflammatory bowel disease is said to be immune-mediated chronic intestinal condition. There are 2 types. You have your ulcerative colitis and you have Crohn's disease. The highest incidence is in Northern Europe or UK and North America. Okay, greatest incidence is among white and Jewish people. The incidence among your Hispanics and Asian people is also increasing. Okay, IBD, there is an inappropriate immune response to the endogenous commensal microbiota within the intestine. Genetic considerations such as your familial in origin, in 10% of IBDs is being entertained. So these are the familial conditions that can lead to IBD. Endogenous commensal microbiota within the intestine plays a major role. So during early life, your commensal microbiota is being established. Specific components of this microbiota can promote or protect from disease later in life. So a state of dysbiosis suggests the presence of microorganisms that drives the disease into inflammation. So both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease both may have inflammations that are likely due to genetic predisposition. The immune inflammatory response is perpetuated by your T cell activation. So, as to the ulcerative colitis, it affects your rectum and extends to the whole colon. The rectum and the rectus sigmoid is affected in 40 to 50% of patients with pseudopolyps. Beyond the sigmoid, but not the whole colon, 30 to 40% may have developed pseudopolyps. You may have affection or inflammation of the entire colon among 20% of the patients. The inflammation is said to be continuous with no normal mucosa. If with total colitis, this may involve 1 to 2 cm into the terminal ileum. When you do endoscopy, what you see in ulcerative colitis are superficial and mild backwash ileitis. Mucosa is said to be erythematous and has fine granular surface like sandpaper. While in severe cases, you may see hemorrhagic, edematous, and ulcerated lesions. And microscopically, this is limited to superficial mucosa and submucosa. You may also appreciate villus atrophy, crypt abscesses, and basal plasma cells. So this is the example of your ulcerative colitis. So you see that there is a severe colonic inflammation with erythema and friability, and you may see exudations during colonoscopy. What about your Crohn's disease? Your Crohn's disease can affect any part of your GIT. So that means from your mouth to anus, you may develop Crohn's disease. Your small bowels are affected in 30 to 40%. Small bowels and large bowels, both affection is seen among 40 to 55%. Colitis is noted in 15 to 25%. In 75% of your small intestine disease, your terminal ileum is involved in 90%. So the most commonly affected portion of the small bowel is the terminal ileum. Rectum is said to be spared most of the time. And what you see, the lesions are said to be segmental or with skip areas, unlike your ulcerative colitis, wherein you have a continuous lesion. Okay? Your perirectal fistulas, fissures, abscesses, and anal stenosis are common in Crohn's disease more than your ulcerative colitis. And what you see is a transmural process. So by endoscopy, what you see are obtuse and small superficial ulcerations. You may appreciate stellate ulceration in more active diseases. And histologically, what you see is a normal mucosa with cobblestone appearance. You may also appreciate pseudopolyps. The bowel wall becomes thickened and narrowed due to fibrosis and thickened mesentery, which is scraping path, and adhesions and fistula formation can also be appreciated. Histologically, what you see is a non-cacheating granuloma. So what are the clinical presentation of your ulcerative colitis? Your ulcerative colitis may present with diarrhea. Usually this is nocturnal and right after eating. Patients may complain of rectal bleeding. There is usually tenesmus or urgency with feeling of incomplete evacuation, passage of mucus. So what you see is diarrhea with blood and mucus. Okay. The pain is crampy. The abdominal pain is said to be crampy and usually located at the mid-lower abdominal. And patients may develop anorexia with nausea and vomiting. And of course, weight loss. Some will develop fever or low-grade fever. Okay. So these are the manifestations of your ulcerative colitis, the mild and moderate and severe. So based on the bowel movements, all of them will develop. Ulcerative colitis will present, as I said, with diarrhea with hematochezia and mucoid. Okay? And patients may develop abdominal pain, but usually in the mid, lower, or hypogastric region. Okay? So as to the diarrhea or the frequency of bowel movement, it is said to be mild if the bowel movement is less than 4 per day. Moderate if it is 4 to 6, and more than 6 is said to be severe. Your blood in the stool, okay, in mild, sometimes you don't see it, but in moderate, no, I'm sorry. Your blood in the stool is always present, okay? In mild, you may see it, and in severe, as the term implies, there is severe bleeding. So in mild, there is mild bleeding, moderate, there's moderate bleeding, and in severe, there's severe bleeding. Now, the fever, your patients with mild ulcerative colitis may not develop fever. Moderate may have low grade, and high grade fever is expected in severe cases. Okay? Your anemia, again, may be mild in mild ulcerative colitis and becomes more and more severe as the disease progress into severe. Your ESR is said to be more than 30 if you will do it, your ESR. And your endoscopic appearance, endoscopic findings, what you see in mild cases are only erythema, decrease in the vascular pattern, and fine granularity. In moderate ulcerative colitis, you will see by endoscopy marked erythema with coarse granularity, with absence of vascular markings, and you may see bleeding, but you don't see ulcerations. Only in severe cases can you appreciate ulcerations with bleeding. All right. So how do we differentiate your ulcerative colitis from Crohn's disease? This is very important, okay? Usually your ulcerative colitis will present with bleeding, as I said. Your stool is with blood and mucoid. And this is not so common in Crohn's disease, okay? Your systemic symptoms, such as your abdominal pains, is not as severe as in Crohn's disease, okay? Your abdominal mass, rarely can you feel or be able to appreciate abdominal mass, but in Crohn's, you may palpate an abdominal mass, okay? Significant perineal disease is not commonly seen. Even the complicated fistula formation, intestinal obstruction, this is more frequently seen in Crohn's disease. So in other words, ulcerative colitis tend to be a little bit more benign in terms of presentation clinically. The pain is more severe in Crohn's disease, and usually pain in Crohn's disease is usually located in the right lower quadrant, while in ulcerative colitis, it is in the middle lower area, so which is your hypogastrium. During endoscopy, you see continuous lesion in ulcerative colitis. You don't see normal mucosa, while in Crohn's disease, what you see is skip lesions. In other words, you see ulcerations, erosions, erythema, and then normal mucosa, and then again ulcerations and erythema and inflammations. While in ulcerative colitis, there is no normal mucosa that you can appreciate because it is a continuous disease. Okay, so you also appreciate cobblestoning in Crohn's disease, but you don't see this in your ulcerative colitis. And you may see granuloma in your Crohn's disease, which is absent in ulcerative colitis. On X-ray, okay, you don't appreciate the abnormalities in your terminal ileum. You don't appreciate segmental colitis or asymmetric colitis, and small bowels are not affected. All of these are characteristics of Crohn's disease. Okay, development of stricture, both may develop stricture, but this is more common again in Crohn's disease rather than ulcerative colitis. So how do you diagnose? As we said a while ago, both may have increased ESR as the disease becomes uh, more severe, then your ESR becomes more exaggerated. You may have an increase your C-reactive protein, ESR, platelet count, leukocytosis, fecal lactoferrin, which these are the specific markers for your intestinal inflammation. You should take a very good history on your patients, the clinical symptoms, and the negative stool examination for bacteria, because you have to rule out also Clostridium difficile toxin, or you may have to rule out amoebiasis or amoebicolitis before saying that this is really an inflammatory bowel disease. So you may do sigmoidoscopy to assess the disease activity. This is being done before your treatment. So if it is not in flare, you may do colonoscopy to see to assess the extent and the activity of the illness. By colonoscopy and by endoscopy, you may see mild disease. You may see erythema and decrease in the vascular pattern and mild friability of the mucosa. Okay, so spontaneous bleeding and ulcerations are only observed in severe cases. Okay, so this is the endoscopic appearance or the colonoscopic appearance of your ulcerative colitis. So what you see is severe inflammation of the whole area with erythema and friability with exudates. Okay, and you don't see any normal mucosa. So what are the complications? Massive hemorrhage happens in only 1% in severe ulcerative colitis. Usually, this stops with your treatment. Total colectomy is done if your blood transfusion is more than already 6 to 8 units in 24 to 48 hours. So there's massive hemorrhage. Your toxic megacolon, it affects your transverse or right colon with at least more than 6 cm diameter, and there is loss of hostration. And 5% may have severe attacks, 50% of which improves with your medical management. Now, you entertain total colectomy among patients who did not improve by medical management. The most dangerous complication of your IBD is your perforation. And stricture may happen only in 5 to 10%. So what are the features of your Crohn's disease? This may present as an acute or chronic bowel inflammation. It affects your terminal ileum, and this is the most common site of your inflammation. So patients will present with recurrent right lower quadrant pain and diarrhea. So unlike in your ulcerative colitis, your patient will present with hypogastric pain, okay, colicky pain, but not as severe as your Crohn's disease. Patients will present also with diarrhea, but with hematochezia or with blood in the stool and mucus. Okay, so in Crohn's disease, what you have is you have a recurrent right lower quadrant pain and diarrhea. Sometimes it may mimic your acute appendicitis, especially so if this is the first time that the patient will have their attack of Crohn's disease. Most of the time, the most common differential diagnosis is acute appendicitis, considering that the pain locates at the right lower quadrant. Okay, you may be able to palpate a mass. You may develop a right lower quadrant pain. You may develop fever and leukocytosis. So if there is colicky pain and on top of weight loss and spiking fever, think of a complication such as your colonic abscess. Toxic megacolon in Crohn's disease is quite rare. So patients may present with epigastric pain, with nausea and vomiting, and usually when you do H. pylori testing, patients turns to be negative. There are two patterns for your Crohn's disease. your fibrostenotic obstructing pattern, and your penetrating fistulous pattern. So your diagnostic procedures when you do your ESR and CRP, just like your UC or ulcerative colitis, both of them are increased. They may develop also leukocytosis, decrease in albumin, and the anemia may be severe. Your fecal lactoferrin and calciprotectin used to distinguish between your IBD and IBS. In Crohn's disease, this is being a request in Crohn's disease to differentiate if this is due to really to the inflammation is really due to inflammatory bowel disease or just irritable bowel syndrome. Okay, so when you do colonoscopy, so endoscopic findings, the typical description is you spare your rectum. So there's rectal sparing, there are aphthous ulcerations and fistulas, and of course, your skip lesions, meaning to say there are normal mucosa while you see these aphthous ulcers and inflammations and stricturing, there are intermittent or normal, abnormal, which we call skip lesions. You may develop stricture in the terminal ileum, even in the colon. Perforation as complication happens in 10% of patients. So this is an example of this is capsule endoscopy, wherein you see the first column is your terminal ileum, okay, and your column C has a severe or deep ulcerations, and there are deep ulcerations and inflammations and hyperemic and some cobblestoning. So which means that is a Crohn's disease. Well, and you see there are some normal pattern which is typical of your Crohn's disease. So what are the complications? Complications are as follows: fistula formations, perforation. Perforation usually happens in the terminal ileum. You may develop peritonitis, but once you develop this is said to be fatal. Your intra-abdominal and pelvic abscesses are common. It happens in 10 to 30%. And of course, your intestinal obstruction due to stricturing is more common than the development of your abscesses. Massive hemorrhage can be also appreciated, malabsorption, and severe perianal disease. So these are the difference between your ulcerative colitis and your Crohn's disease as to its clinical, endoscopic findings, and radiographic findings. Perhaps you should try to go over this and bear this in your mind, because it is very important for you to understand that the difference between the two. And usually, the difference between your ulcerative and your Crohn's disease usually is being asked in the board exam. Okay. What are the differential diagnoses or diseases that may mimic your IBDs or inflammatory bowel disease? So these are the infectious and the non-infectious differential diagnosis. You just go over them. Now, let's go to the extraintestinal manifestations of your IBDs. They may present as erythema nodosum, okay, in 15% in Crohn's disease, while 10% in ulcerative colitis. Usually, this is presented with active peripheral arthritis. What you see is hot, red tender nodules at the anterior surface of your lower extremities may be seen on your ankles, on your calves, on your thighs and arms. Pyoderma gangrenosum may be seen in 1 to 12% of your ulcerative colitis. Rheumatologic, you may develop peripheral arthritis in 15 to 20%. This is more common in your Crohn's disease. Usually, the arthritis is said to be asymmetric, polyarticular, and migratory. It affects your large joints of the upper extremities and lower extremities. You may develop ankylosing spondylitis in 10% of patients with Crohn's disease. So sacroiliitis is symmetrical in ulcerative colitis, same as with Crohn's disease, but usually they are asymptomatic. What about the eyes? 1 to 10% may develop conjunctivitis, may develop anterior uveitis, iritis. So there's inflammation of your iris, episcleritis, okay? So patients will complain of ocular pain, photophobia, blurred vision, and headache, okay? If you do ultrasound, you may see fatty liver with hepatomegaly and gallstones. Patients are prone to develop calcium oxalate stones as well. And they are said to have lone bone mass, and sometimes thromboembolic disorders may also happen. So few of the patients may develop endocarditis, myocarditis, and interstitial lung disease. So there are so many extraintestinal manifestations of your IBDs. So how do you treat them? These are the drugs being used, pharmacological drugs that being used for the treatment of your inflammatory bowel disease. Now, your 5 ASA agents are effective in ulcerative, but it has a limited role in your Crohn's disease. So what are these 5 ASA agents? You have your sulfasalazine, you have valsalazide, Delsicol, Azacol, Pentasa, and Salopac, which are present or available in the Philippines. Glucocorticoids in the majority of moderate to severe inflammatory bowel disease, these are given at the dose of 40 to 60 milligrams per day of prednisone, and then you start tapering it down. Antibiotics has no role in the treatment of active or quiescent ulcerative colitis. But metronidazole and ciprofloxacin are good for
Okay. Okay. Are there any questions? So if none, are there any? Wala? Okay, so we'll proceed with the other slides for irritable bowel syndrome. It will take only around 20 minutes. Can you see it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Everyone, today we're going to discuss irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome is a functional bowel disorder characterized by abdominal pains and discomfort and altered bowel movements without any structural abnormalities. The diagnosis is based on clinical presentation, and there is a predominance of female affected by this syndrome. Okay? There are 10 to 20% of adults and adolescents having irritable bowel syndrome. Before we use in 2016, we used to use ROM3 as a criteria in the diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome. But right now, we use the ROM4 criteria. So by definition, IBS is a functional bowel disorder characterized with abdominal pains and discomfort with altered bowel movement habits. And there is no detectable structural abnormalities. Okay, what is the ROM4 diagnostic criteria for IBS? There is a history of recurrent abdominal pain on the average at least one day per week in the last 3 months associated with 2 or more of the following criteria. First, it is related to defecation or bowel movement. It is associated with a change in frequency of defecation or stool, and it's also associated with a change in the form or the appearance of the stool. The criteria fulfilled for the last 3 months with no symptoms onset at least 6 months prior to the diagnosis. Malnutrition in IBS is rare. There is unusual sleep deprivation, and it is said that IBS may be exacerbated by your eating or emotional stress, and it's improved by the passage of your flatus or stools. Female patients have worsening symptoms, usually during premenstrual or menstrual phase. What are the clinical features? First is abdominal pains. It is a prerequisite. All IBS should complain of this abdominal pains. It may be episodic or crampy. Usually this is only mild and sometimes it can be ignored by the patient. Pain is usually relieved by passing out gas or flatus. And among females, as I said, the pain worsens during premenstrual or menstrual phase. What about the altered bowel habits? This is a consistent feature of IBS. The most common pattern is constipation alternating with diarrhea. Most patients feels incomplete bowel evacuation. So there are three types. You have IBS predominantly constipation, which is IBS-C, and IBS predominantly diarrhea, or IBS mixed type, meaning to say there's an alternating problems of constipation and diarrhea. Number 3 is your gas and flatulence, okay? Patients would always complain of abdominal distension or increased belching or flatulence. The upper GI symptoms, sometimes dyspepsia, heartburn, nausea, and vomiting, may be maybe symptoms also of IBS. Around 25% to 50% of IBS may have concomitant dyspepsia and heartburn. So there's an overlap between your dyspepsia and IBS. What is the pathophysiology? The pathophysiology of your IBS until now is poorly understood. The cause of your IBS is multifactorial. Evidence of visceral hypersensitivity and motility disorders are seen, and few may have genetic abnormalities. 30% of patients may have bile acid malabsorption. Gut dysbiosis and impaired mucosal permeability is also being considered. So the cause of your IBS is likely to be multifactorial. Your patient may often have evidence of visceral hypersensitivity and motility abnormalities, many of which have increased anxiety or depression in their symptoms. Genetic studies suggest a few IBS patients may have genetic abnormalities affecting the serotonin transport system in the enteric nerves. About 30% of your IBS patients may have bile acid malabsorption. Gut dysbiosis and impaired mucosal permeability have been reported in many of your patients. This may lead to subclinical mucosal inflammation. So how do you manage patients with irritable bowel syndrome? Patient counseling is important, and dietary alteration. Reassurance and careful examination of your patients is necessary. Meticulous dietary history that aggravates the symptom should be considered. Example, coffee, disaccharides, legumes, and cabbages may exacerbate the symptoms. So you try to limit all the intake of this. Excessive fructose and artificial sweeteners may lead to loose bowel movement and bloating and cramping and flatulence. So you advise your patients to avoid all of these. If these foods, even drinks, aggravates the symptomatology that the patient is having. Still, bulking agents or high fiber diet is very helpful. You may give anticholinergics or antispasmodics for patients complaining always of crampy abdominal pains and bloatedness. Antidiarrheal agents or low dose of your loperamide in 2 to 4 milligrams can be given if patient is suffering from IBS, predominantly diarrhea. Antidepressant drugs are given for patients with depression and anxiety. Anti-flatulence therapy is also given. So, to modulate your gut flora, you may give rifaximin. Prebiotics and probiotics are available. Serotonin receptor agonists and antagonists are being used as well. For your antagonists, 5-HT antagonists such as your allosyntron, this is given for IBS diarrhea, and for your 5-HT agonists exemplified by your tegaserod, this is being given for IBS constipation. Let's go now to anorectal diseases. The first is rectal prolapse. This is 6 times more common among women, elderly women at that, more than 60 years old, and are highly associated with pelvic floor disorders. Usually, patients would complain of urinary incontinence, rectocele, cystocele, and enterocele. Prosidentia is another term for rectal prolapse. It is characterized by circumferential full-thickness protrusion of your rectal wall. This is associated with redundant sigmoid, pelvic laxity, and deep rectovaginal septum or pouch of Douglas. The result of damage to the nerve supply of the pelvic floor muscles. So what is affected is your pudendal nerves specifically. So how do you manage patients with rectal prolapse? You may give stool bulking agents or fiber-rich foods. It may be corrected by surgical correction of rectal prolapse, which is the mainstay of the treatment. So it may be done by a transabdominal approach or transperineal approach. What about hemorrhoidal diseases? Hemorrhoidal tusions are a normal part of the anal canal. You have 3 hemorrhoidal tusions. You have the left lateral located at the 3 o'clock, right anterior complex located at 11 o'clock, and the right posterior located at your 7 o'clock. Engorgement and straining leads to prolapse of this tissue outside of the anal canal, which may give rise to 2 types of hemorrhoids: your external hemorrhoids and your internal hemorrhoids. External hemorrhoids originate below the dentate line and are covered by squamous epithelium, while your internal hemorrhoids, this originates above the dentate line and is covered with mucosa and transitional zone epithelium. So what will be the presentation? Usually, painless bleeding is being complained by the patient. There may be protrusion, there may be pain if it is thrombosed, and there may be concomitant pruritus. So an external thrombosed hemorrhoid may give rise to a very painful anal pain. In other words, anal pain is the frequent complaint, and patients would always tell you that they cannot even defecate or even sit down because of the pain. So this is a typical example of your external thrombosed hemorrhoids. Patient would tell you that they are able to palpate some nodule or a mass protruding in their rectum, which is very tender or very painful. So think that this is an external thrombosed hemorrhoid. So on diagnosis, okay, you do direct rectal examination, or you may use anoscopy. Later on, you might do more diagnostic exams such as your sigmoidoscopy or colonoscopy to rule out malignancy in the elderly. So what are the stages of your and treatment of your hemorrhoids? You have 4 stages or 4 grades. So grade 1 to 4 or stage 1 to 4. So your stage 1, it is described that there is enlargement with bleeding of your hemorrhoid, and you treat this with your fiber supplementation. You may give short course steroids, or you may give suppository and sclerotherapy or infrared coagulation. Your grade 2, there is protrusion with spontaneous reduction. Excuse me. So again, this is being managed by same as your stage 1. Your stage 3 has protrusion requiring your manual reduction. So it cannot be reduced spontaneously, but you have to push it back. So again, the treatment now is fiber supplementation. You may give steroids and suppositories, and this time rubber band ligation, or you may opt to do operative hemorrhoidectomy. Stage 4 means that there is irreducible protrusion. So the fiber supplementation and steroids, but this time rubber band ligation is not already a consideration, but surgery is the main the best treatment option for irreducible hemorrhoids. So again, in summary, this is the management that we can do for patients with suffering from inflamed or enlargement of your hemorrhoids. You may give high fiber diets. You may ask your patient to do hot sitz bath, may give stool softener. You may do rubber band ligation, sclerotherapy for bleeding, and infrared coagulation. Your surgical intervention is entertained in grade 3 and grade 4. What about the complications? Complications are you may develop pain, infection, recurrent bleeding, and sometimes urinary incontinence. Okay. So what about anal fissure? Anal fissure occur at all ages, but are more common in the 3rd through the 5th decades of life. The most common cause of rectal bleeding in infancy is anal fissure. So males and females incidence are equal. This is associated with constipation, with diarrhea, infectious etiologies, perianal trauma, and even Crohn's disease. So what is the pathophysiology of your anal fissure? Trauma to the anal canal following defecation is the definition of this. This is common in the posterior anal canal, but may also occur in the anterior. So your differential diagnoses are tuberculosis, syphilis, Crohn's disease, and malignancy. Irritation caused by the trauma to the anal canal results in an increased resting pressure of the internal sphincter. The classic complaint of your rectal fissure is, of course, pain. This is strongly associated with defecation and is so relentless. The bright red bleeding with the fissure is less extensive than with the hemorrhoids. Chronic fissure is defined as hypertrophied anal papilla at the proximal end of the fissure and a sentinel pile or skin tag at the distal end. If anal manometry is performed, elevation in the anal resting pressure and a sawtooth deformity with the paradoxical contractions of the sphincter muscles are pathognomonic. So how do you manage patients with anal fissure? You give stool softeners, you increase the dietary fiber, you give topical anesthetics, you may give glucocorticoids, and hot sitz bath will heal in 60 to 90% of your fissures. Your chronic fissures are those who present for more than 6 weeks. So you may give nitroglycerin or nifedipine ointment because these are smooth muscle relaxant, botulinum toxin type A, and of course, surgical management. Recurrence rates from medical therapy are higher. Lateral internal sphincterotomy may lead to incontinence and more commonly in women. What about abscess or anorectal abscess? Men are more predominantly affected than women, 3:1, and the peak incidence is on the third to fifth decade of life. Patients would complain of perianal pains plus abscesses coming out. More common among immunocompromised patients, those patients who are diabetics, for example, having hematologic problems or IBDs and HIV. So there is a recurrent perianal infection. The pathophysiology of which is infected anal glands due to stool accidentally entering the glands. So what is the presentation? The hallmark is your perianal pain plus fever. One differential diagnosis for this is IBD. There is difficulty in voiding and usually blood is seen in the stool. So what other diagnostic examination that you can see on CBC? You may see predominance of WBC or leukocytosis. By CT scan or MRI, this is 80% accurate, and doing a colonoscopy to rule out IBD. So the treatment, the gold standard is still incision and drainage. Antibiotics is given for immunocompromised or those with prosthetic heart valves and diabetics or IBDs. So let's discuss now the causes of your constipation in adults. So we're done and we're almost done. And right now, I just want to run down the causes of constipation among adults, which is a common complaint of patients coming to the clinic. So we divide this into the recent onset and chronic constipation. For recent onset constipation, usually patients would present with colonic obstruction, anal sphincter spasm. The obstruction may be due to neoplasm, stricture, ischemic, and diverticular inflammatory problem, while your anal sphincter spasm may be an example of these are your anal fissures and your hemorrhoids. What about the chronic reason for your constipation? The chronic reasons for chronic constipation may be due to irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, predominantly constipation, your medications, colonic pseudo-obstruction, disorders on your rectal evacuation, endocrinopathies, psychiatric disorders, neurologic disorders, and generalized muscle disorders. And an example is on the other side of our the other side of our slide. Okay, so IBS, so constipation predominantly or alternating or mixed type of IBS predominantly, constipation and then alternating with diarrhea. Now, the example of drugs that can give rise to chronic constipation may be patients who are on antihypertensive treatments such as calcium blockers and antidepressants. Okay, while an example of neurologic disorder is Parkinsonism, multiple sclerosis, and even spinal cord injury. Okay. What about patients with presented with lower GI bleeding? So this is a good algorithm, all right, for patients who presents with lower GI bleeding. I'm sorry. Okay. Patients who have no hemodynamic instability for age less than 40 years old, flexible sigmoidoscopy would help if there's minimal bleeding, or a colonoscopy is a recommendation if there's a copious bleeding or a family history of colon cancer and even iron deficiency. So patients who are more than 40 years old or more than 40 years, colonoscopy is necessary. Okay? Those patients who are hemodynamically unstable, you may do upper endoscopy first to check whether the bleeding is coming from the upper GI or the lower GI. Now, If the patient is too unstable for bowel prep, for example, you may go to CT angiography to detect where is the bleeding coming from. Okay, if you are able to do colonoscopy, okay, you may identify the site of the bleeding and you may do the therapeutic to control the bleeding. If you are able to identify the site, or if you were not able to identify it, then you may proceed to further workup, such as doing an angiography or RBC tagging for that matter. Or eventually, if the bleeding still persists, surgery is recommended. Okay, so a normal colonoscopy, for the information of everyone, this is a good example of a normal colonoscopy with a very clean bowel prep on the patient. Okay, so this is the end point of your colonoscopy, wherein you see the ileocecal valve, all right, and the periappendiceal orifice, as you see on the 12 o'clock. That is a clean periappendiceal orifice. I think that's all for now, and thank you for your.
Okay. Do you have any question? Okay, if there's none, you may take your lunch and good luck on your exam next week. Bye, everybody.